Good morning. I'm Jay Robinson, and thanks for spending a few moments of your day, whether you're seeing this on a Sunday or some other day of the week. Thank you for your patience and for your faithfulness during what is still a difficult time for us locally and people all across the country. So we still want to lift everyone up in our prayers who are working in medicine, who are working to care for the sick, and also for those families who have been touched directly. Our pandemic, we're fatigued, but it is not over. Thank you for your faithfulness and your patience. And thanks again for letting me share a little bit of the word with you today. The scripture reading from this week's lectionary that I'd like to share with you is from Genesis 22, 1 through 14. I'll be reading from the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. This is a very familiar story. You've heard this before. After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham?" And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will show you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there, we will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father, "Abraham." "Father?" He said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." So the 2 of them walked on together. When they came to the place where God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. In Jerusalem, you can go to that place, supposedly. You can go to the place where, according to tradition, Abraham went with his son Isaac. And there he offered him as a sacrifice. At the center of the Dome of the Rock, there in Jerusalem, there is a large stone. There is a rock that is venerated and lifted up as the place where Abraham went with his son. The Dome of the Rock, of course, is a Muslim temple built on top of what used to be Solomon's temple, which was destroyed by Rome in 70 AD as a part of the Roman-Jewish war and Holocaust. So the Jewish temple was also built, theoretically, on the spot where Abraham had gone to sacrifice his son. In Muslim tradition, that's also the place where In Muslim tradition, That's also the place where Muhammad goes into heaven from that very same spot. There is in the ancient world this idea of it's called the Axis Mundi. It's the idea that there are these places on the earth where heaven and earth touch. And this is that place. But we were discussing the temple here at Jacksonville First Church. In my brain, I did not mean to say temple. Maybe we'll have to do the sermon all over again. The steeple. Temple, steeple, same thing. That the reason why steeples are in tradition the way they are, they're not just ornaments to stick up on a building. They're almost like a lightning rod to signify a little mini Axis Mundi. This is a place where heaven and earth are touching. And the steeple pointing up to heaven is giving that sense of vertical connection, right? So this place where Abraham goes to sacrifice his son is really that singular place. And the reason why religious facilities and buildings have been built there for centuries upon centuries. We do that, we want to build a memorial. We want to remember things about this. This is a part of who we are. I think it's very much in our soul that when we have significant events and significant places, that we want to create a memorial. And we want to remember that. And so we want to build something there so people can keep coming back to that place. And that makes perfect sense that we would do that. And it makes perfect sense that we would have a church building that I'm in right now, a place that we could gather, a place that contains a sense of our shared life together, almost a living memory and a living testament, even to those who've long since passed away. And so it's good to care about that. It's good to care about the buildings that we build and the monuments that we create. But monuments also get us into trouble. There's a fine line between memorializing and mythologizing something. We memorialize so that we can accurately remember. We mythologize so that we can take a little bit of a thing, a little bit of history, a little bit of a memory, and turn it into an epic tale. And the controversy over memorials and monuments to the Confederacy are once again ravaging across the country. And the delicate part of that is that there was a real history to remember. And we should always remember that. But to what extent were the statues and memorials built to the Confederacy about memorializing, or was it about mythologizing? I'll give an example of that slippery slope. When, in a political rally this last week, the president referenced Confederate memorials in his speech and said, and I quote, "They're trying to take away our heritage." Now that's very interesting because, see, he's from New York and he's talking to people in Oklahoma. Now, Oklahoma wasn't even actually a thing during the Civil War, so I don't really understand why someone from New York talking to people in Oklahoma, referencing Confederate memorials, described them as our heritage? Our heritage? See, we've gone way beyond history here. We're not talking about history anymore. We're not talking about remembering the past. We're not talking about remembering people in both good and bad. We've slipped way over into mythologizing. And we are conflating these two things together. I don't really know why the Confederacy has to be Southern heritage in the first place. Why is that the thing that we all want to talk about? I'm from Alabama, so I understand that. But why can't we have sweet tea and barbecue as our heritage? We can bring the world together around sweet tea and barbecue, let me tell you. And I don't mean this watered down sweet tea. I mean the kind of sweet tea that you could put on your pancakes if you'd run out of syrup, kind of sweet tea. Why have we lifted up the most contentious and the most divisive part of our past? Slavery is our original sin, not South's original sin. It's the original sin of this continent. And everybody shares in that. And everybody has been trying to get to a better place, to understand where we truly came from and how we can create new paths forward, where we overcome that. The entire country is covered in that original sin. Well, since when did we want to talk about sin as heritage? What? And the notion of these monuments and these statues, I think that Southerners should listen to the advice of Robert E. Lee. 4 years after the close of the war, the first of the monuments were beginning to be built at Gettysburg Battlefield. If you go to Gettysburg Battlefield Park right now, you can't walk 5 feet without tripping over a monument to something. It is definitely the most memorialized, monumented place of acreage, I think, anywhere around. So those very first monuments, Robert E. Lee was invited to participate in those. Partly because in the monuments they wanted to figure out exactly where the different line of battle was, where the troops were when things were happening. And it's a big, sprawling battlefield, so there was a lot of moving parts there. Robert E. Lee declined. He did not go. He did not attend, and he said, "Don't do that." He spoke out against the creating of monuments because it would keep the wounds open. It would keep the wounds open, and we must heal the wounds. Now, at that very same kind of groundbreaking of the monuments at Gettysburg 4 years after the war, several thousand veterans of both the North and the South went to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania to participate. And they reenacted Pickett's famous charge across this mile-wide open field toward what now historians call the apex, this little this little stone wall that became the high water mark, as it's often called, of the Confederacy. So they reenacted the battle, and when they came together at that spot, these old veterans, well, they weren't that old, shook hands and began the process of healing the wounds. The memorials, the ones that are being taken down now, they weren't about any of that. They were all put up in the last decade of the 1800s and the first 2 decades of the 20th century, as a part of Jim Crow, as a part of the end of Reconstruction. And if I just don't allow people, and nor should you, allow anyone to conflate that with Southern heritage. Because these were attempts, deliberate attempts, not to remember, but to mythologize and to keep open a wound. How we've been reminded of how military installations, so many of them were named after Confederate generals. And when you look at why are we naming military installations, I mean, there's no such thing as a Fort Benedict Arnold anywhere in the country. Why did we suddenly start wanting to name military installations against officers who took up arms against the United States? So that itself is odd and perplexing that anybody ever thought that was a good idea. Besides the fact that some of these military installations, like Fort Bragg in North Carolina, is named after Braxton Bragg, probably the worst Confederate general in the war. So why didn't you at least name it after a good general, like maybe Longstreet? General Longstreet's from North Carolina. Why didn't they name that after him? Oh, wait. Maybe it's because General Longstreet, who was Lee's number 2 lieutenant throughout the war, maybe it's because he lived to be an old man and became very critical of the war and wrote critically of Lee. So we can't name military installations after him, I guess. And what about Fort McClellan, right here? George McClellan. You know, I want to see a show of hands. Who can tell me anything about George McClellan? Doesn't really work this way, I guess. George McClellan was the commander of the Army of the Potomac, of the Union Army in the first part of the Civil War. Kind of imagined himself a little Napoleon. He really kind of always decked out. It's kind of his thing was always being perfectly dressed and perfectly coiffed and all. Apparently was a very horrible field general. He looked like a general, I guess. And after 2 failed attempts, second at the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln fired him. So he leaves the army in somewhat disgrace and decided to run against Lincoln. So in the 1864 election, he was Lincoln's opponent. He ran on a platform of ending the war, allowing the states to secede and keep slavery in perpetuity. Now, thankfully, Lincoln cleaned his clock in the 1864 election. What's that guy doing being named in honor, military installations being named in honor of him? What's going on there? If that's our heritage, we can do better than that. Now, if you'll give me a second and let me go back to the original text from Genesis. Because the story is not just about the faith of Abraham. That's how it's almost always told. The faith of Abraham. It certainly is about that. But it is also about a shift in culture and a shift in cultural values. And the story serves as this iconic moment to say that the children of Abraham and those who follow after him are going to do one thing very, very, very different going forward. This marks a dramatic cultural shift. Can you guess what that shift is? Human sacrifice. We might think that's the most craziest, bizarre thing in the world. I mean, it is in the Bible, and God did tell him to do it, so it isn't that crazy. Abraham didn't freak out when he gets the word, because that was a really normal thing to do in ancient, almost kind of prehistoric Mesopotamia in which Abraham lived, and this era is written about. Child sacrifice was a normal part of Canaanite religion and culture. Abraham surely was a part of that. And doesn't go bonkers when he first hears the word that he should do that too. And so when God then tells him, don't do that, what are you doing? Don't do that. He's got the knife in his hand, he's ready to go. Wait, what are you doing? Well, that is crazy. That's crazy. Don't do that. And we stopped doing that. And people stopped doing that. The children of Abraham never did that ever again. To what extent they might have participated in part of that Canaanite pagan religious cultures that they inherited when they went into that land. We don't know to what extent they might have done that as a part of their own culture. But for Jewish culture and for Christian culture, this was a break. Don't do that. We can change. We can do something different. And all of our faith is all summed up in that promise. Don't do that. That's not good. But here is grace for different. We can be different. We can behave differently. We can treat one another differently. So in the Gospel of Matthew, in one of the other lectionary readings for the day, there's this line from Jesus where he says, if you give even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones, that in the culture of God, the heritage of our shared faith, that greatness is discovered not by commanding armies in times of war. That greatness is measured in the simplest acts of compassion, even the simple acts of a cup of cold water. Let us, you and I, do all that we can to heal the wounds of our country, of our friends and our neighbors. Do whatever we need to do to change that culture and to create a more compassionate, more loving, and more just world.